right. Well, thank you for having me. I've already really enjoyed the morning and the pipe cleaners and the googly eyes and everything that you all created. I also just spent about 10 minutes changing and adding some slides that I have from some work we've done that I realized was relevant to this conversation as we were having it this morning. I'm mostly sharing that as an excuse to bear with me because I now no longer know the order of my slides and they're all going to be a big surprise as they come up, but I feel like this is a comfortable, safe group to be within. Okay, so this is what I'm going to cover in the next 20, 30 minutes-ish, is that right? Okay.
3 days. 3 days.
Take it. Just really briefly who I am and what context I come from and my personal experiences that I bring to this conversation. I work at the Kavli Foundation, so I'll share a little bit of the Kavli Foundation. Much of what the work I'll share comes from things we've funded or landscaping we've done. And then I'm going to focus on two things we've done at Kavli. One is we've done some landscaping and understanding of what are field-wide opportunities and obstacles in building an infrastructure of public engagement that's relevant to these conversations. And then we also have a partnership with the Department of Energy called SIPEP, which stands for Science Public Engagement Partnership. And we've been looking for the past couple years with our colleagues at the DOE at how some of those characteristics of communicating or engaging publics might be unique if you're doing it in the basic sciences and the discovery sciences, which of course much of physics sits in that. Okay, so really quickly, just a bit about me, just for context. I just wanted to share my education is grounded in science. The reason I share this is my bachelor's degree and a master's degree is in science. The work I always wanted to do is actually what we're talking about here and what I've gone on to do. I didn't know that at the time, of course. It was like, kind of found my way there. But notably, I put this up there because I don't have a PhD, nor did I want one, nor did I ever try to get one. But in my career, I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, oh, that's too bad you didn't finish your education and get a PhD. Yeah, but I think that's really relevant to some of our conversations here too. I'm very comfortable with that and very proud of it because I think this is the degree I needed to do the work I do, but that's part of building the respect and infrastructure that I think we're talking about here. And then I've worked in a number of different arenas as a practitioner, as someone who facilitates community and discussions, as an outreach officer, yes, we use that term, and yes, that's okay sometimes, for academic institutions. I ran a communication training program called Compass, which you may or may not be familiar with. I helped found that organization like 15 years ago. And now I'm at the Kavli Foundation, where I've been for 5 years as the Director of Science and Society. And actually, the foundation has been around for 25 years, and I'm the first person to have that role. We've only had funding in science and society for the past 5 years. And the nice thing about the Kavli Foundation, what we're bringing here, is being at a philanthropic foundation is really a great privilege, and one of the things you get to do is understand what is going on across the landscape of all the work happening to inform both what we might fund, but also because we are in a position then to do landscaping and share that with the field. So some of that will be shared here too. Okay, so just a quick bit about the Kavli Foundation and where we come from. We were established in the year 2000. This is Fred Kavli, our benefactor. We're based in Los Angeles. Fred was Norwegian and moved to LA as a young adult to start his business. He made a lot of money making some of the first sensors that brought GPS to the world on anything that flies, airplanes, satellites, anything that goes into space. Fred was an engineer, and he felt very strongly that he was able to have that business and make the money he made because he built his business based on what we've learned from basic science. The work happening at institutions and academia, discovering key elements of how the world works. He used and leveraged that and moved that into the marketplace. So he left his entire fortune to the Kavli Foundation to fund in basic science, because he said we need to keep having that machine to be doing discovery and understanding how things work to benefit humanity in a number of ways. So we are very focused on the majority of what we do is fund scientific work in the fields of theoretical physics, astrophysics, neuroscience, and nanoscience, which Fred called the big, the small, and the complex. And like I said, we have this program that I oversee that's about the relationship between science and society, and a number of grants in a portfolio there to do just that. And that came to be after Fred passed away about 10 years ago. The Kavli Foundation board recognized that Fred cared not just about funding the science, but its relationship with people. So they created that program after Fred passed away and our endowment grew. And we also honor scientific discovery through the Kavli Prize, if you're familiar with that. The reason I bring that up today is tomorrow morning we're announcing our next Kavli Prize laureates, which is quite a big deal. It happens every 2 years, so look for that tomorrow morning. We have laureates in physics, nanoscience, and neuroscience. Okay, so the two things that I said I wanted to talk about, we've done work in landscaping, infrastructure for public engagement, as well as then thinking more deeply about what that means for basic science. So I want to start with the work that we've done in kind of landscaping the infrastructure of public engagement more generally. This was actually one of the first things I did at the foundation. It started in about 2018. We did this for a couple of years through 2021. We did it with some other peer foundations listed down here at the bottom. And we asked this question, how can we advance a sustainable system so that when we're engaging and communicating about science, it can be done effectively, it can be sustained, it's not a one-off project. And so we spent about 2 years with our peer foundations convening a series of workshops of people who identify as doing this work with these institutional affiliations as their affiliations. And what we did is, in addition to having these workshops, we also funded some folks to do a white paper and do some research before those workshops about each of those topical areas. So for example, like we had someone interview communication trainers across different fields and understand, like, what are you struggling with, what's going well, what can we learn from that. So we had these workshops informed by landscape research as we went into them. So I just wanted to share a couple things that we heard from that work that may or may not be relevant to the conversations you all are having here today and tomorrow. So first of all, for the training community, we supported these two folks, John Besley and Anthony Dudo, to do that research for us, to interview the training community and understand what the obstacles and opportunities are. There's actually a white paper about each of these and about the conferences, and I can point you to those. They used to very elegantly live on the CASE website, which no longer exists. And so we have a new home for them, but I'll have to say they're a little harder to find now, but if you want to dig into all the reports, they're quite interesting. So a couple things that John and Anthony found. First of all, they said, communication training programs to help support scientists to be more effective at engaging with all kinds of audiences are like the Wild West. They are popping up all over the place. There are people creating them who have no experience in communication training, but they might be a biologist who's like, I need to work better with the public, so that can't be too hard to create a program in communication. I'll just create my own program. And so they said this, and they shared this with both, of course, it's a double-edged sword. Like, that's great that there's a lot of people recognizing this work needs done. And then the other side of that is, but is it effective? Are they basing it on scholarship? Are they basing it on experiences happening? And are we creating a giant infrastructure of folks doing this work that might not be doing it well? And they also found out when interviewing trainers that they were really surprised by this idea of how the deficit model lives strongly in communication trainings. And I think, does everyone here know the deficit model? I feel like this is this idea that if you want someone to know something, you should just tell them what you know and then they'll know it without actually connecting with them, engaging with them, listening to them. And one of the things that John and Anthony shared, which I thought was interesting, is their surprise of how when they dug in with trainers about, like, what are you actually teaching scientists to do? They would say, oh, well, it's not the deficit model. We know that that's a bad model. They're like, okay, what are you doing? And they say, well, we're teaching them how to lecture effectively, clearly, and kind of all the tenets of what might actually be within a deficit model. And the other thing that they talked about too is how poor evaluation is in this space. I'll talk about it in this training space. Like, are we really evaluating how effective our trainings are and how that's working in the world? We actually learned through this whole area and effort that that's for all of our engagement activities too. So are we just doing a lot of engagement, but then not stopping to say, what changed because of that? Like, did the scientists change? Did the publics change? Did the science that we're doing change? And that this is increasingly an opportunity to build up some capacity and infrastructure. And as they said it, a lot of folks, their way of evaluating things say, did you have fun at my event? Like, fun equates with the change we're seeking, and perhaps there's some opportunities to move past that. And then the last thing that I'll share about this communication training, look, is really wrestling with who within the scientific community are you working with to be out there engaging with publics. And of course, it doesn't have to be the scientists themselves, but that was a lot of what this particular branch focused on. Who's doing that training, and who are you training and preparing to engage with? And the idea there being, we tend to be training a bunch of people that look like us and to engage with people who look like us, and how diverse and inclusive are we really being. And an interesting point on this too that they found is the majority of people doing communications training across the board for any kind of science are white women. And the dynamic that that makes, especially when working with scientists, which is largely male, and we've had a lot of conversations then about that power dynamic, and maybe as we're talking about lack of respect and trust, it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of females doing the work to get out there in the world while the men get to do the science in the lab, and that's something that we might struggle with as a community. Okay, another thing that we looked at is what are scientific societies doing to support their members and to support the topics and the disciplines they're working on to engage folks in the world. I'm just gonna share what I thought was a really powerful piece of data for this. So Shupei Yoon, we supported her she did a survey of scientific societies, all scientific societies across basic and applied disciplines, to ask them, what are you doing to support your members? And how are you supporting programs to support your members or to support the topic, the disciplinary topic you work on in being more engaged in the public? And I'm just gonna share one piece of data that I thought was really interesting. She did it as a survey, so it was an online survey, people took it, and she sent people a list of what are all the different things you're trying to do? What are your goals as a society for your engagement programs or supporting engagement? I'll also add, before I show you this data, because it's going to take a minute to unpack it, she and others did this for AAAS members a couple times. So they had a data set where they sent the same survey out to all members of AAAS and said, why do you engage? What are you working on? So she was kind of comparing what are all the membership of the largest general scientific society in the world working on, and then what are the societies doing to support that, and is there things that might show like similarities or differences? So at the top, these are all the options she gave scientists in the AAAS survey, the orange. And at the bottom, the brown, are all the ones she gave societies. They were worded differently, so these are the words that she had. The details of what the thing is not what matters. What matters is when she compared, what she found is it's exactly opposite. So what AAAS members prioritize highest is maybe the lowest that societies prioritize, with the exception of one thing, which is both the members and the societies all prioritize very last. The thing I care about the least in engaging the public is hearing what people might think about my work and demonstrating that we're listening to what communities or others might think about scientific issues. So that was a really kind of stark realization that both our societies, and again, generally speaking, sure not APS, but our societies are working on different things than their members might care about. But fascinating that no one thinks how to support efforts to listen to the people they're engaging with. That it's dead last on both. So that was a big eye-opener. Okay, and then we had Julie Rissian, who is at Oregon State, talk to folks at universities and university systems. And what she did was, I thought, super interesting. She actually held focus groups of different kinds of positions at universities. So she did focus groups of some university presidents, some focus groups of some chairs, some focus groups of some active researchers, some focus groups of people who are doing the practitioner work of informal science education or engagement, and talk to them about what do you see as your barriers and obstacles. The two that I just want to share that I've just stuck on one slide, these are from Julie's slides herself, is that might resonate with the conversation here, this idea that the disconnect between the lip service of the higher ups in the universities, so the presidents, provosts, talking about, of course we do that. We are an engaged institution. We care about engagement. It's our tagline. It's written on the bridge at our university, to the students, the scientists, the folks doing the engagement being like, we have no support, no one cares about this, and just the way that came across, that stark difference. And then also, of course, Julie brought up, and she talks about this too, like the big elephant in the room during all these conversations was promotion and tenure and how engagement helps or doesn't help that. The observation she had, which was really interesting, is I think that a lot of us talk about, oh, well, the folks who are just coming up through the education system and the early career scientists, like they want to do this, so it's going to change. And she's like, no, those people are leaving. Like they want to do it, and then the system doesn't support it, so they're leaving. And so it's actually not changing, and it's making the existing culture like worse because those people are kind of winning, because the folks who want to have engagement as part of their jobs are like, well, I guess I can't do this at this institution or this university. I'm going to go do it at a museum, a nonprofit. So we're actually losing a lot of this culture of engagement within academia because of this. And this idea of, oh, well, the early career folks want to do it, it's just generational, we'll be fine, is maybe not correct. Okay, so here's just my kind of overview slide. There's so much more richness in all of that, and I'm happy to talk about other pieces of it. But we really saw after these years of workshops and landscape reports, like a number of bright spots, right? Like we're seeing the willingness and interest to engage increase. We're seeing much more data and scholarship and an attention to realizing if we understand or have data and scholarship about engagement or communication, we should use that and not just be doing this out in a vacuum. A lot more connections, like, I mean, even the existence of this group, and there's a lot more of those kinds of things, people doing this work, trying to find space to be more connected around it. And in fact, in that spirit, one of the things that came out of this series of workshops was a new kind of loose network that Eve is involved in that I don't know if you'll talk about, but you can talk about it during a break, called the Listen Network, intentionally called Listen, which stands for Leaders in Science and Technology Engagement Network. So like folks who are leaders of this organization, plus like a different similar organization that exists in bio, or a different one that exists in science communication training, getting together on a regular basis to share what they're struggling with, what they're doing, new ideas, so that the larger field. So that's now housed at Aztec, the Association for Science and Technology Centers. It's that backbone of just bringing those folks together at a more meta level. And then also acknowledging some of the challenges that exist, that even though there is more scholarship out there, there's not a lot done to connect that scholarship to practice. You can read those on your own. They're all things we've talked about. I don't need to go over them, so you can read that list. Okay, so I actually gave a similar, longer talk about all the things I just covered at a summit of engagement and communication professionals at National Labs about 4 years ago, and talked about everything we're learning. And when I left that summit and had dinner that night with leadership of DOE that was there, we all sat around and said, that's all super interesting. And also, when we look at the networks and look at folks doing this, the vast majority of them in the science communication and engagement space are working on climate, are working on vaccines. And so we were like, is everything that's being talked about across all these different areas relevant if you're working in the discovery science side of it? So it was at that time, like in those discussions, that we decided, let's look into that together. And so our partnership with DOE was actually born from that, this idea of, this is true across the broad field of science communication and engagement. That's a huge field across many disciplines, and are there things that matter for disciplines within that? And so we had this question, is anything unique about basic science when you're doing this kind of work? And so for the past 4 years, we've been working with DOE on kind of similar things. We've been doing landscape studies, funding new research on this, having conversations and workshops and some online conferences, which I hope some of you came to. And so we created SciPep, the Science Public Engagement Partnership. And that was really rooted in our shared, we're funding basic science. The majority of what DOE does is fund the basic science. Our foundation funds basic science, so we had this shared interest in understanding this area more. Everything I'm about to talk about, if you go to the scipep.org website, there's a link that says resources, and in that link we have all the papers we supported, all the landscape studies we commissioned, links to all the conference videos or online workshops that we've done. So if you want to dig more into any of this, you can find it all fairly, I think, easily navigable on that website. Okay, so we're wrapping up our partnership with SciPep. This is the last year, so something to keep in mind too that's coming up this year. We are putting out at the beginning of the fall a digital summary of everything we've learned, which may be useful in some of your work. So that's in progress now, so look for that. The Journal of Science Communication is publishing a special issue on scholarship related to what we know about communicating basic and discovery science. That's in progress as well, and that'll be published in October. And the editor of this journal is currently based at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, so they're also going to have a symposium to talk about this scholarship. If any of you are interested in going to South Africa in November, they're hosting a symposium on this topic, which would be very relevant to everything that you all are working on. Okay, so there's going to be better curation and synthesis of some of the things I'm going to share over the next few months. Okay, so the first kind of question we wrestled with is, what do we even mean by basic science? What is basic science, and is basic science even a thing? We had Sarah Yo from the University of Utah look at this a little bit, and we kind of unpacked it less from what science you're doing and more how scientists identify and where they see themselves, like what kind of science they see themselves doing. So as she was doing research and polling scientists about various communication engagement things she was doing, she snuck in this question of where do you identify on the spectrum, and then was able to pull that from lots of different data sets she was working on. And what she said is, it's not, as we expected, it's not black and white. It's not I'm basic, I'm applied, and it's not there's basic and there's applied, but it's rather a spectrum, and the basicness or appliedness might fall on the spectrum. And in fact, most scientists see themselves as doing a little bit of both, which I think is important to recognize. As we think about what we were doing in SciPep, we were kind of thinking more about like, okay, so the folks who are kind of to the left of that doing both, like what are some special considerations we might need to keep in mind? And I imagine your constituency, a lot of it falls on this side as well. Okay, so then the next thing we did is we said, what in the scholarship and the literature is about basic science, so that we can pull that together and synthesize that. We had this whole plan to find it and synthesize it, but we funded 2 scholars to do lit reviews, and they said, we can't find it. So instead of synthesizing it, we went on to fund a few new studies that might shed some light on what some unique things might be. But one of our scholars, you can find both these reports and you can look at their methodology, like what journals they really looked at. But Todd Newman from Wisconsin looked at this, and he looked at STEM journals. So not the communication journals, not the informal education journals, but the actual STEM disciplinary journals, and found 43 of 1.5 million articles talked about basic or discovery science, communication, or engagement in some way. And then John Besley looked at the communication journals, and like the behavior and the Journal of Science Communication, JCOM, those kinds of things, and found that less than 5% of the things published there specifically articulate anything about basic science, communication, or engagement. And the vast majority, I don't know if you feel this, I feel this too, are a lot around the applied side, especially the controversial things, GMOs, climate, vaccines, all super interesting, but sometimes we found ourselves in a room listening to best practices of communicating vaccines, and I'm like, well, what does it have to do with string theory if I'm engaging folks on string theory? Is that like relevant? So we're going to conferences and learning about best practices with heavily applied science, and kind of ask the question, is that relevant? Okay, so a couple things we looked at then. We dug into this from the context of, as you know, for good strategic communication or engagement or informal education, 2 of the important things you need to think about are, what am I trying to do? What are my goals with this? And who are my audiences? Who am I trying to work with? And so we wanted to better understand for basic science, what are the goals that basic scientists, people identify on the basic side of the spectrum, have in communicating engagement? And what audiences are they most interested in engaging with? So John Besley, again, did this work for us. And he also was part of that group that did it with the AAAS membership, so he was able to compare that too. And basically what he found, this is a list of audiences, and so they you can look at their methodology, but they scoured every author in every STEM journal that identifies with basic science in some way and sent them this survey. So that was their outreach on that. And essentially found that most scientists that identify as doing basic science prioritized all the goals and all the audiences, almost all pretty equally. And if you look at their data set from other applied sciences, like you'll see in the climate space, the policymaker audience is like really, really high, and so they're really focusing on that. So the kind of question this left us with it is, if you're prioritizing everything, are you really prioritizing anything? And that perhaps in the basic science space, just saying, we're gonna do everything we can for the public is not specific enough. And so there might be more work. And I'm not saying this is something that maybe it is, or maybe I'm speaking on all basic science. You might say, we're great, we got this down, like we figured this out, we focus heavily on goals. But in general, like the stark difference between folks who identify as basic being like, it's all, and that makes it kind of not strategic. Okay, and then the other thing we did is we worked with folks at Science Counts, the Alda Center, and University of Wisconsin on some existing data they had to take a look at it in a different way. And so one of the things that Science Counts has done, if you know that organization, is do survey work of the public of how they connect with science and what the public feels about science, and do they support it, what excites them about it. And they put together this really interesting, what they call the hope-joy matrix. And so the idea is they would give folks words that associate with hope and some that associate with joy, and ask like, how do you relate to science? And so the public, scientists really connect with things that are about potential hope. What are we gonna get out of this science? What is this science gonna do for the world? Why is it gonna be good for me and make the world a better place? And then they went back and did the same questions with the scientists doing the work and said, you know, what do you identify with when doing this? The majority of scientists said, not this. They were like, the process of doing science. Like, we identify with the journey of science. It's not that we have this ultimate hope, that's great, but like it's the journey. And so his first cut of this data just showed like scientists here and the public here, which shows at the broadest sense for science and the public connections that scientists are talking about. Let me tell you about the process of my research. But people might really want to hear about how does that help the world and help the world be better. And then we asked them to go back and do a disciplinary bifurcation of the scientists who have answers to see, do basic scientists or applied scientists feel differently about this? And essentially, the more kind of basic leaning you are, the more processy you are. And the more applied you are, the more you're like, well, like if you're an engineer or social scientist, you're kind of more down in this hope thing. But this really showed us this major potential disconnect between, we have a bunch of people who want to talk about process with audiences who want to hear about hope. And is that maybe an opportunity to, you know, really think through that goals audience piece. And then we also dug into, I'm just gonna skip this, we dug into curiosity, because we hear a lot from our scientists that we're working with, or our efforts working to engage science. It's all about curiosity. People are curious, we're curious, our job is to ignite curiosity. And we're like, what does that mean? And what do we know about that? And I just shared like two high-level examples, because there's, as many of you are probably familiar with, a pretty deep literature on curiosity and how curiosity is formed and what that looks like. I would imagine that's very relevant to your work. Two things that kind of came out for us is Tanya Lombrosa, who's at Princeton and studies this, really making the point that curiosity actually fuels more curiosity. Like, it's a very powerful driver. If you can grab people's curiosity, you got to take it somewhere, because there's more to come and there's more potential engagement to happen, which is something that Eve's going to talk about next, so I won't belabor that. But that was coupled with another curiosity researcher, Daniel Silva Luna, who said, but we have to remember that your curiosity is not the same as someone else's curiosity. How you built your systems of wonder and awe might be very different than another person. And too often we hear in science engagement that curiosity is this like one-dimensional thing that everyone has and it's all the same. And have we really done enough to unpack, as we're trying to engage people in curiosity, that idea of listening? Can we listen to why those folks are curious instead of just telling them why we think it's cool and curious, and find some more engagement around curiosity? And I'm excited to learn more about all the work you all are doing probably in this space. Okay, and then in the same space, in terms of goals and audience, we also wanted to think a little bit about this idea of relevance. When we look at that hope-joy matrix, the best way to connect to an audience that might be motivated by something different than you is to finding something relevant between your world and their world. And this is something that came up a lot with us, this idea that frustration within the scientific community, that means I have to talk about some eventual utility that my science is related to, which is not at all why I do the science, and I don't want to pigeonhole it into some potential future iPhone or vaccine constantly, because it's really the process of science that matters. And so we really wanted to better understand like something there so that we're not forcing folks to like go to an audience relevance that they're uncomfortable with, because as we know, to communicate about your work, you have to be authentic to yourself too. And if any of you know Dr. Monica Filio-Mujer, who would be a great person to connect with and have talk with this group, she really, she's at Ciencia Puerto Rico in iBiology, and we have a really nice opinion piece from her coming out soon that she was just like, why is relevance always about utility? Why in basic science does it have to be brought down to the utility of something? Relevance is about connection, and can we rethink the paradigm of what we mean by relevance, and that it's not about utility, but it's all the ways that I have an experience that's similar to yours and we can connect around that. And is that a way then to bring people into the process of science, not just the product of science? So I'll share with you this essay, and if you go to the SciPep website, she did a session at our last conference and a keynote about it that you can watch that I think is really interesting. Okay, and that brings me to the end. So just from a high level, if there's anything about the infrastructure work that we're doing that's relevant to this conversation, or anything as you're thinking about infrastructure that maybe is special because it is physics, or special because it is basic science, that's worth talking about. Those are things that I thought would be useful to bring up to inform your conversations, and happy to discuss any of them now, time permitting, or later. Thank you.